Hey, everybody, I'm back. I think it seems to me there might actually be a problem with the Steam server. So, more reports in the past. There have been a few reports in the past few hours, and if you look at the map, there's quite a few in London where I am. So, I don't know. I don't think I can play Elden Ring, unfortunately, for now. But what I can do is still talk to the two guys uh, that I was going to talk to. Anyway, so I'll have to yeah. It's going to be a chatting stream at least at first, and we'll chat about what we were going to chat about. It's just going to be a little bit less visually entertaining. Well, let me go to my guest. Let me go to my guest thing, and I'll see if I can get them on. Hello,
Hello. How are
hello,
you?
hello. I'm good, thanks. How are you doing?
Oh, just fine. Yeah, it's a nice day here in DC where I'm at, so
Is
it's
it?
a good weekend that I haven't had things planned in a while, which is always kind of nice.
I'm exactly the same. I've literally been away from London for like 5 weeks in a row, and I'm just like so happy to actually be in my house for a weekend.
Yeah,
For once, it's been
exactly.
the weather's average as it often is in the UK, but yeah, it's nice enough.
At
Um,
least it isn't like a million degrees or whatever it
well,
was
I
there
do prefer
the
this to
past.
38 degrees. I have to say
Yeah,
that was ridiculous. I mean, things started catching fire. Like obviously not in my house, but in the UK in general. Yeah, that was it was pretty unpleasant. So so you
Chicago is right
have you
now a great. I have so I'm outside Lollapalooza right now. My apartment's not too far away, so I hear the sort of the beats at night just going off until midnight. It's not too bad.
That sounds good. That sounds good. I was literally just about to ask, do we have bad Bayesian here? Because you hadn't said anything. So everyone, we are live by the way. So everybody, for chat, these two guys I know as Bad Bayesian and WJ Brown one, I think, but they do have real names and they are professional economists. So we were going to do this while I was playing Elden Ring, but it seems like the Steam servers are down. But that's fine because it'll still be very interesting to speak to you two. And by the way, I want to say two things. First, thanks for coming on the screen. Secondly, thanks for being my Discord mods for like a year and a half without obviously just voluntarily. It's been really helpful.
Of
yeah,
course.
yeah, absolutely. This is actually the first time I've ever done anything like this, so I will attempt not to embarrass myself or I guess economics in general.
Embarrassing yourself is just part of streaming. I think. I think that's basically the best way to
Yeah,
do
it's
it
fair.
from
It's
my experience, which is a bit limited.
Same.
So guys, I was just wondering if I usually introduce the guests, but I think in this case it might be a bit better for you guys to introduce yourselves and like your real names, and just like what kind of economics you do, what role you have now, what kind of research you do, because I'm really interested in speaking to you two. You're both outside of academia but working as economists, as I understand, or maybe at least you've got one foot in academia and one foot outside of academia. So just please tell everyone, like, because people will need to know what economists do, and just please, like, in turn, if you could just chat a little bit about it, and take your time. It's fine. We've got plenty of time. So I guess we could start with Bad Bayesian, aka Daniel.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. So I actually don't have a PhD, and I've never had a economist title. But I guess my claim to fame on your Discord server is that I studied at the belly of the beast, the University of Chicago, did my undergrad and master's there, and I've also studied or also worked at the IMF for a bit. So two places I know your community has, uh, opinions about.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. We'll probably hear those
um,
in chat. see those in
Oh
chat.
yeah. Let's see. Other places I've worked at. I've worked a little bit at the IRS, or sort of the tax agency, doing some research there. And now I'm in consulting, where actually my previous client was with cryptocurrencies. That was a fun one. So I guess I'll be the villain of the stream for now.
We need a stream villain, so it's a good role. And so yeah, I guess WJ Brown, aka is it? I forget your name, William.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's super easy to remember because I made my Discord name way back when I wasn't in any Discord communities, and it was just like my friends and I was like, oh, I'll just make my name like whatever my name is in real life. So yeah, I hold a PhD from Purdue University. I did both my undergrad and graduate studies there, so I was there for quite a long time. Um, when I was in grad school, I did research in behavioral stuff. Specifically, I did work in like behavioral political economy, I guess is what you would call it. So I did a paper on basically how people behave in different voting mechanisms. And then I have another paper kind of on generally like how leaders act in groups and how leaders are picked and how that affects behavior and stuff like that. So I finished up my graduate studies almost exactly a year ago. I graduated from Purdue in August last year. And following that, I moved to DC. Currently, I'm working as a researcher and economist for a software company, a tech company here in DC. Um, and what that means on a day-to-day basis sometimes means different things. If I was to use kind of fancy buzzwords, I'd say that I work in AI, but anybody I think who works in or adjacent to AI knows that that doesn't leave a whole lot of description for what I actually do. Um, but yeah, so I've made the journey from spending 5 years as a grad student in kind of an academic space to now working in tech, which is has its own pluses and minuses. But overall, I'm pretty happy with, I'd say.
Yeah, so I mean, starting with you, so when you do like economics in tech, what kind of economics do you do? Like, what kind of economics do tech firms use? I know that's a very broad question, but I'm kind of, I want everybody to sort of learn like what economists do.
Yeah, so I work in a very similar capacity to what probably like just what an applied mathematician would do, which is I think different in different industry sectors. You might work more closely as or in a similar capacity to what you would as like an academic researcher. But in my case, my job is basically one part like coding development, and then one part when we have basically a new product or a new process that we're trying to develop for software. I'll be responsible for going out and like reading the academic literature about usually more things that are metricsy. So really kind of applied mathematics focus, and then translating that and writing some prototype code that then the other like computer scientists and stuff can build off later. So I don't do a lot of like applied research with big data sets other than like what my company basically uses. But I'm kind of the one of the go-to, I guess, math guys, I would say, within the team that I work.
Okay. So like what kind of like things do you work on? Like what does an economist like add really? Is it like just because I'm getting like a lot of you have a lot of mathematical and statistical knowledge and stuff. Is that sort of the main area where you say you like add value? Or I'm sort of curious about like what economic ideas are used in these firms.
Yeah, my value is definitely in whatever the theoretical mathematics are about like what we're adding. So and it's kind of funny because getting used to working in tech, there's a lot of language that you have to translate between what they use there and what we're used to talking about in economics. But it's a lot of it's just a lot of like kind of agent modeling and statistical estimation on that part. And then they'd use different terms, I guess, in AI and tech that you might have be like less used to if you're coming from like an academic econ space, and then you make the translation. It's like, oh yeah, like for instance, something like a term that's thrown around in our workspace is something like agent-based modeling, which is just like or feature-based modeling, which is just like, oh, I'm going to estimate a model that has covariates in it most of the time, which is kind of funny if you're used to working in one space and then you move over to another and they just use different words for the same thing. Um,
Yeah, I get that a lot as well from my time at the startup called Civic Analytics, which was like a political consulting firm, kind of the democratic version of Cambridge Analytica. And there,
The good is this a good version of Cambridge Analytica? Are we saying?
I mean, I guess it depends who you ask. We
wow.
didn't have as many
Bayesian just
controversies.
hitting all the bases between the IMF and Cambridge
So
Analytica.
you've worked for the IMF and basically Cambridge Analytica as well, Bayesian. Is that
Wow.
what you're telling us?
If I had done my schooling in the UK, that, I mean, maybe. I don't know if I could stomach it, but we'll see. But there, in terms of the sort of the econometric methods, like I was in an R&D team trying to bring research from the academic world and trying to apply it in sort of a business setting. And the business setting was like, okay, how do you get people out to vote, or how do you convince people to donate, and that sort of like question. So there, the causal inference methods, or the stuff that you talked about in your Jordan Peterson video, are very applicable to that. And so that was a fun time. And actually, my manager was I believe he was heterodox. His name is like Skipper Siebold, and he does a lot of stuff with and with like stats modeling and the Python community.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, so one of the things is that I'm kind of interested in is something that you were touching on, especially William, was like when you go from doing economics in academia, where everybody's using certain jargon and stuff, to going and doing it in the sort of quote unquote real world. Like how difficult is that? Do you find it difficult to communicate like economic ideas to people?
To a degree, yeah, but I think it's actually a skill that people in economics generally probably need to learn. Like, I'm sure that your experience and most people that work in academic economics, like the language that gets used is a little bit insular, I think, to put it lightly sometimes. And it's interesting and good experience to talk to people in my capacity where like there's a lot of very highly educated people that I work with, but they're all from kind of different backgrounds. So I work with people who have advanced degrees in civil engineering, and people who have their education or practical experience in computer science. Um, and I would say that there definitely is some challenges every once in a while about communicating what would be probably like if everybody used the same language, everybody would be on the same page about between people from different backgrounds. But it's definitely like a good skill to learn. And I spend a lot of time probably adapting my knowledge to just whatever the standard kind of terms and technical aspects are to my work because it's it would be ridiculous for me to expect everybody to conform to like what my background is. But in general, I think learning that kind of skill set to be able to talk about these kinds of things with people from a variety of backgrounds is probably one of the more important things that you can learn. When I don't know, it can come from either just when you go work in a new industry or when you're trying to communicate your ideas and your research. It's something to keep in mind that I'm not totally confident that everybody in the econ space necessarily keeps in mind.
I completely agree. I had to talk to physicists. I had to talk to or people with physics backgrounds. I had to talk to people with sociology backgrounds, with English backgrounds. Like the tech space is has a lot of people from different backgrounds, and just being able to cross a language barrier is it takes a lot of work and is very much required.
Yeah, I mean, so I was wondering, Bad Bayesian. I keep flitting between your like Discord name and your actual names. But if you could, and I'm just trying to, by the way, set up something on the stream viewing. I don't know if you guys are like watching it with a lag, but
Yeah.
something that verges on being visually exciting for people. So, but yeah. So you spent you've spent a fair amount of time at the IMF, right?
So no, at the IMF, I only spent around 7 months. I think
Okay.
I've yet to update my resume because I switched jobs
Uh,
to EY.
okay, that's what's confused me because when I looked at it, it said to present, and I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
thinking you were still there. But anyway, so like how does the IMF actually work, and like what type of economics do they use?
Sure. So the IMF is a big place.
Mm.
It's a very like bureaucratic place, and there's lots of different departments. So I was specifically in their research department on a theory team. I was working on this thing called the integrated policy framework, which was sort of like their general framework of like how they're going to help countries out in the context of COVID, with whether it's like balance of trade problems. So maybe something of like what's going around in Sri Lanka right now. Like having a theoretical model and sort of presenting some mathematical structure and some empirical evidence for why this model versus something that. So that's at a very high level of like what I was doing, and then specifically my role was they needed someone. These models can get really complicated really quickly, and sort of I came in with sort of my background in economics and programming, computer science, to try to help them actually like reason through these models, because just the standard mathematical tools that these economists were using were just they weren't cutting it. And so that was my contribution to that. And in terms of that, like I'm very surprised that more economists aren't using sort of these more tools that I'm talking about. I think the best example of that is the Fed with Julia, um, and that's where I took most of my inspiration for the work I was doing.
Okay, so when you say when you say, could you explain like what? I'm quite interested in like some of the maths that's used, and I don't know. Try and explain it, I guess, as simply as possible for us. But like, what was wrong with what they were doing before you developed your approach, and like how does your approach work, and how does it differ?
Sure, sure. So I wouldn't necessarily say there was anything particularly wrong with it. It's just that when you're trying to model, the world macro economy, like that's a very complicated problem, and they were
Mhm.
trying to sort of throw, everything but the kitchen sink in sort of the modeling that they're trying to do. And when you sort of build on these models, like there's just stuff on multiple equilibria problems that you're not really sure how to solve, or what it means to have those multiple equilibria problems. So what do I mean by that? Like, economists like talking about some optimization, and we can do an example of like, here we are, we can meet at my place or we can meet at your place, and we have to like coordinate whether we're going to meet at your place or we're going to meet at my place, because the last thing we want is for you to be at your place, for me to be at my place, and then we can't hang out. And so
Mhm.
solving those types of problems, but then in the context of like balance of payments, or in the context of like, oh, I ran out of money and I don't know what to do. Um, just the math wasn't cutting it for that type of work.
So the balance of payments. So how would this help with like a country's balance of payments then? So what type of like intervention or policy are you talking about improving to try and are you trying to basically reduce a balance of payments deficit or something like that, right? So a country's I'm guessing a relatively poor country is exporting more compared to its imports than it was, or what exactly were you trying to do?
Sure. So a lot of this is sort of they had the standard neo-Keynesian framework, and then they would add sort of like fun twists depending on what they think more accurately reflects the world problems. So like one aspect of this that was what's her name, Gita Govinoff, who really pushes, the previous head of the econ team there, the chief economist. Um, Her work with like dominance paradigm, which is this idea of like, the U.S. dollar. Everyone's using the U.S. dollar, and so there's going to be situations where some countries don't have enough money, don't have enough of their own currencies to buy the U.S. dollar, or they might not have enough of some other currency to do whatever they want, and there's some sort of constraint in their ability to borrow. Um, so that's like one little aspect of the model, and then another aspect might be like, oh, there might be some weird externality that is causing this other distortion, and it's sort of putting a little bit of a Frankenstein's monster model together to try to you know make sense of what the hell was happening during COVID and what's still happening during COVID.
Yeah, yeah, right, okay. So would you, what would you like? What would you end up doing as the IMF, or what would the IMF end up doing? And were there like any changes in policy while you were there, as a result of like the stuff that you developed?
So that's a good question and probably above my pay grade. So
you're not sure.
well, I mean, I was there. I was there as like a for 7 months, and in this particular role where it was a bit of like contract work slash, um, like what they do is that they have these like fixed term contracts, and so I mean I had my contract renewed, but then life happened and I ended up going to a different place. Um, but my work was more on the extension to what is currently on their website of the integrated policy framework, and I'm happy to share the link, and they have different variants of the file of like the document about this. One super mathy and one more to like a general audience. But I haven't seen like an updated version of this, or I haven't looked for it.
Right. Okay. Okay. So it's difficult to say, but I guess like if I guess what I'm trying to get at is like let's say that you are suddenly it is your pay grade and you're the dictator of the IMF and you can follow through all of your like models recommendations. Like what are the main things you
Uh,
would do?
I at this time I don't know if I could say like all the different things that or the implications of the model. Um,
Is there
Whether
like
it's
one
because
thing that sort of comes out of it that you would take away as like maybe something that could be improved in policy
is there one thing I could take away?
from
Sorry, what was the
from the
question?
model or from your analysis?
I mean, the biggest thing is just COVID's a really complicated problem,
Yeah.
and like breaking breaking supply lines causes a lot of issues that it seems like economists really, I mean, in some sense they did expect, but in other sense, like, COVID's just a really big problem, and I think we should have done better. I
Yeah.
don't know what else,
Yeah.
what better thing I
Is
could say there.
in supply chains, especially? I guess is that because that's one of the things that it's like nobody used the term supply chain, in 2019 publicly, but then after after COVID, it became really really popular. So is that something that you've been especially focused on then?
So I think a better way to think about what I've been focused on is more
Mm.
on the like software engineering side, because I while I am literate in some of the economics, more of what I was able to do was sort of leverage what I like learned, in the private sector with like software engineering, and then being able to take those tools so that the economists could like better visualize or better reason through the implications of what they were actually like modeling with the mathematics. Because I know a lot with a lot of especially with these very mathy, complicated macro models, like you can get lost in the forest very, very quickly, and maybe like 8 people in the world will understand what the hell you're actually doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is often the case. I find that even fellow economists, who are, I guess, pretty well trained in a lot of mathematics and statistics and the rest of it, like even they won't necessarily understand the implications of a model that's like a little bit outside of their field, right?
Right. And I mean, that's why I find, especially the work that like the Fed is doing with their like Julia project, where they're, they're showing all their code. They're doing much more, visualizations to try to break down, okay, what are the, because this is like a high dimensional problem, and there's going to be like interaction effects that, as these models become more and more complicated, are difficult to understand, even just with the math in front of you. So I'm excited that there's been work towards that. And hopefully it's successful, but it's a little early to tell.
It's, these are very measured, very, very economist answers. They're like, it depends. It's very complicated. Time will tell. We'll see. But
Yeah.
I appreciate the honesty. So, yeah. So, William, I wanted to bring you in a little bit to talk maybe about your research, because you did say to me that while you're working, obviously, in tech in a private sector role, you're still kind of, you got one foot in academia, and you still do research. So I was wondering like what type of stuff you research, and if you could speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, so specifically, I have parts of my graduate dissertation that I'm still working on with an idea to get published, with two kind of existing working papers floating out there. So the one that I've been working on most recently, that with a current professor at Purdue, has to do with how leaders are picked in different ways, and how that affects their behavior and how it affects their group's behavior. So kind of the top line research question of that one is, you know, how different institutions pick their leadership in different ways, whether that can be like democratically, uh, like an election, or you could think about an internal company. You could draw a similarity to something like a competition, right? Like people perform at their company, and then they get promoted based on like their performance, for instance. And then a third one is like just completely randomly. Like, let's just we showed up, and then I picked you or somebody else in a room just by drawing lots or something like that. Um, and we measure, one, the effect of how those leaders are picked on like a group coordination task. So they're like picking different, basically, values in a game, and how well that those values can match up with communication from a leader, um, that's being picked in these different ways. And also then there's a task that the leader does that talks about their group's performance that they can basically choose to lie on, and we measure how honest or dishonest those leaders are afterwards, and basically compare the honesty of those leaders after being picked in different ways, essentially. And we do our best to control for the differences between those people, because obviously, like, the kind of person that gets picked from being a leader in a competition is probably going to be different than somebody who gets picked from like being elected into there, and try and basically see if there's differences in behavior with that. So that's one that I'm actively working on as a co-author.
Is that
The
so?
implica-
That's an experiment, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess to take a step back further, like my actual graduate studies involved experimental economics, where I worked directly with human subjects. So it was the most kind of sideways move, and a weird skills matchup for how that brings me into tech, because if you've never really participated in one of these behavioral studies, what you do is you come into like a computer lab, and you play a game or go through some exercise on a computer, and then whoever the researcher is kind of recording those. Uh, Sorry, hold on. Unplug both of them, then plug the router back in. Wait 30 seconds. Once the router is back on. Okay.
I,
Yeah. So, how how those work is you'll come into a computer lab and you'll do some sort of exercise, and the economist is in the uh, is recording kind of your decisions, and then they take those decisions you've made and then study them on the back end. So I had to write these computer programs for which you do these experiments with, which is how I got my like coding background, which is how I end up in tech. But yes, the project that I was just talking about is one of those behavioral studies.
Yeah, so it's just like basically somebody who has been elected, let's say elected democratically, is gonna behave differently to somebody who's maybe won it, through some kind of competitive process. Is gonna be like a different type of leader to somebody who was selected randomly. Is going to be a different type of leader to someone who was selected by fiat, like by some sort of dictator rule or something like that, right? So what do you have? I mean, I'm guessing. The answer to this will again probably be something like it depends. But do you have a sense in which mechanisms for picking leaders work best in which situations, and which are, for example, less likely to encourage dishonesty?
Yeah. So we've it's kind of a hard thing to get at and measure as anything with kind of human behavior. Like these kind of estimations on like effects are really kind of imperfect, like you said. So the cop out economist answer would always be it's complicated, but we actually do find pretty significant evidence to suggest that people who are selected from basically like a group election of their peers tend to behave more honestly than those who are selected from a competition, or at the very least, we can say they don't behave more dishonestly. Um, so there's a little bit of evidence suggested that those who are picked from a competition behave kind of in a more self-motivated kind of way, um, versus those who are picked through an election tend to be a little bit more pro-social and honest with the basically answers regarding their group's choice, even when they're incentivized not to be. Which is, as a person who likes voting and likes democratic institutions, is kind of the answer you like to see, but um, it could have turned out any other ways. And there's some other research in adjacent fields that shows that there's kind of like these entitlement effects regarding how people are picked from competitions and the subsequent decisions afterwards. So it's
Mm.
not a huge surprise or necessarily like out of the realm of expectations that would be the kind of result that we'd see.
So is this just does this just mean worker democracy is good? That's is that too much of a leap from your experiments to take
I
that
mean,
away?
I'd certainly say so. The standard couch is like, how much does this kind of behavioral research inside our experiment is the term would be like externally valid. Like how much does this institution that we've implemented apply to more complicated ones? But I mean, I support those kinds of initiatives just outside of my own kind of experience in these experiments. But yes, I'd say that um, from this study, we can say that people who are chosen by their peers to be leaders of their groups tend to be a little bit more honest with regards to their own behavior, which is what we would want.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then so is your other research on a kind of similar theme?
Sort of in the sense that and the funny thing is like when these are entered into a thesis because they're different chapters of the same one, you have to find kind of a common theme to like how to title your research together. The other research that I did was actually on like behaviors in different voting systems, so it wasn't necessarily about like honesty, although I really like research in ethical fields like that, but it was more of um, the kind of the top line argument of that one was, if we make voting systems more complicated, like how does it affect people's decision making? Do people rely on kind of more heuristic kind of rule of thumb decision making as the mechanisms by which we choose outcomes in elections get more and more complicated. So, like in that study, basically, I compared a really simple, like, first past the post plurality voting mechanism to a ranked choice voting mechanism to like a point-based voting system, and did some estimation on how complex people's decision making was within those, with kind of the result being what you would think the obvious answer, but is which is as these systems get more and more complicated and people are faced with more and more complicated decisions, their kind of complexity in the decisions that they make is decreasing. So we would say that they choose simpler strategies, I guess, in the lingo of the study itself. Which again, I think intuitively makes a lot of sense, but it's also important to find some sort of empirical evidence that backs up those kinds of claims.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, yeah, so I mean one thing I wanted to chat to both of you about, like, is kind of economics, right, as a whole. Which is I mean, I don't that's an absurdly broad thing to say, but sort of the perspectives on economics, and that this is kind of what I've named the stream. So you've both got experience from like quite different areas. One area is kind of more so. Daniel, you're more like macro and international macro, right? As well as a whole lot of programming and mathematics as well. Whereas William, you're more on the side of. Sorry, I've just managed to get Elden Ring working, by the way. So you're obviously more on the side of like experiments and like kind of I guess social choice theory, things like that. Oh God.
Yeah.
So I guess like what's your perspective? And I guess I'll ask Daniel first again to come in on this. What's your perspective on like how useful economics is and economic theory is for understanding the real world? Do you find that it really helps you in like your work and stuff? Because I mean, a lot of people, and you know, I have some skepticism here myself, sort of see it as a bit too abstract and not really of that much practical utility.
Sure. So I think there's a couple different fields to think about. So I think one for me that's been very obviously useful, or that it has clear results, is a lot of the like statistical methodology. Whether it's whatever complicated regression or and all the like derivations from that. I think that has been useful in sort of establishing some claim empirically. And I mean you see regressions in other fields as well. So that one I'm not too particularly worried about. Where things get a little bit more dicey is, I guess, the macro world, because it's hard to run experiments, and so it's hard to verify things empirically, and that leads to a lot more contention and a lot more like the ideological fighting that we've seen throughout Econ's existence. And on that note, yeah, I guess we'll wait and see, which sort of models end up winning out in the end. And so far, the dominance is, mostly these new Keynesian models. Previously, it was the monetarist, and before that, it was Keynesians. You know, times change, and the model that is the dominant paradigm changes.
Yeah, absolutely. So new Keynesian for everybody in chat, like new Keynesian macro. Oh my god, idiot! I've died. So new Keynesian macro is more like kind of it's these models which basically imply that there's like a role for government, right? So there's a role for like monetary and fiscal stimulus, and they have, depending on the one you use, they have like different mechanisms through which that can happen. There can be a need for these activist policies, right? So are you a new Keynesian then?
Oh boy, I think if I were to say that, my teachers would get very upset with me. I mean,
Because you went to Chicago, right?
right, right,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so New Keynesian's in this interesting spot because in many ways, like Chicago won the econ fight back in the 70s and 80s, at least in academia, in that with micro foundations, which is this the particular style of thinking about the model through like an optimization lens. That you see that in Keynesian models now, and that wasn't really there in the older Keynesian models.
Yeah.
So the new Keynesian models like take a lot of the spirit of what the older Keynesian model is doing, but then they reframe it in this like classical or neoclassical. I always get confused which school is which
Yeah, yeah.
framework.
Yeah, it's a bit of a clusterfuck, to be honest with you, because you've got like you've got neoclassical, new classical, neo Keynesian, new Keynesian, post Keynesian. I mean, and that's just the start of it. I mean, there are some others as well, right? So it could get
Right,
quite
right.
confusing.
And it can get very ambiguous where that like difference is at times, and what specific thing did each school contribute to this now like grander or model or framework or whatever.
Mm.
But you're absolutely right with the Keynesians. Like generally, that's a very like willing to use government levers to stimulate the economy or to fix some externality that exists in the economy, and that's one way of thinking about Keynes, as you probably more than know, being more on the post-Keynesian side.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. But do you think? Okay, so let me put a question to you. So, I mean, for me, so the real business cycle theory, right? Which is like you said that the classicals kind of the new classicals or the neoclassicals or whatever, the Chicagoians, whatever we want to call them, they kind of won that debate within economics of having these models built up in a way that really emphasizes individual behavior and uses all the like utility maximization and all this optimal dynamic control maths that you're very good at, right? So all that type of stuff. And but for me, real business cycle theory, even though they won that battle, it has a lot of implications which just seem to me to be on their face pretty absurd. So like the idea that, for example, recessions are caused by like some kind of exogenous shock to preferences, like you know all the computers disappear, there's a shock to technology, or everyone just decides it's like the Great Depression was the Great Vacation. Everyone just decides they don't want to work anymore. It struck me that seemed very, very wrong. So I guess my question is, was that a useful diversion? Oh my god.
Is that a useful diversion?
through real business cycle
asking
theory.
asking the hard questions.
Yeah.
Let's see. So I don't think I would be sufficiently prepared to say, oh yeah, this paper, and that paper, show, you know, these effects or predicted these effects, and therefore, like, you can start getting some of the falsifiability of this. I don't think I could do that here. And I don't know how much economists can do that in general. That's just not something I particularly focused on. Well, I will say, and a lot of economics is sort of like thinking about this world in this ideal state, and a lot of it is manipulating or like establishing policy so that that world, uh, the real world starts appearing like that. And I think sometimes that could be a good thing, but other times I would completely agree with you that in the journey of trying to make the world seem more perfectly competitive, or then it might not be the best, or it might be the might not lead to the best results. But I
Well,
can't
there's the
say,
theory
yeah,
of the
RGB.
second best, isn't there? That's the first thing that springs to mind, which is an old, it's an old idea
Right.
recognized in mainstream economics, right? Which is like, so the canonical example is like monopoly and trade unions, right? So you got like the perfectly competitive market, and in that case, removing either monopoly or trade unions, is a good thing because you're getting closer to that like perfect competition and it's all optimal and all the rest of it. But then
Right.
if you've got both of them and you remove one, right? Say you've got trade unions and monopoly and you remove the trade unions, well, that actually means the monopolists can effectively exploit their power more, their market power more, and it actually makes things worse.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you, and I do find it interesting when economists, because economists really like talking about unintended consequences of whatever policy. I'm sure you've gone over Freakonomics on stream, and so
maybe not enough actually. Ooh,
sure.
jeez. Okay, yeah.
And so,
but yeah, carry on.
like,
Sorry.
right. I mean, you see people now, like someone like Dubé, who is trained at U Chicago, but is very much, I guess, he's had his fights with the school as well. Making making these, more or very like heretical models to what like the school would traditionally do. So I don't know. I mean, the one thing that I've learned from economics is just like the economy is a very dynamic problem. It's hard to say things, or it's hard to really make these grandiose statements that we would really like to make. Economists, I mean, even now you see some of the work with I'm mostly going to focus on like the labor stuff, but like the minimum wage stuff has had some very interesting outcomes with Dubé's work and other people's work that really shook a lot of these economists like foundations to the core, and so we'll see what comes out from that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the minimum wage literature, and it's like, it is definitely true. Like, I think, for me that this stuff is very complicated. Like, I mean, for the minimum wage, there's all of these debates in econometrics about difference in difference estimators, which are like, actually, to be honest, like a lot of them are, they're getting more and more beyond the level that I'm actually comfortable with. Like, they get extremely complicated. Like, does the minimum wage affect employment? Well, it seems like you could say certainly not in the very mechanical, quite significant, economically significant way that might be predicted by standard theory, but like there's so many caveats to that, right? And we we need to work it out properly before we can make really clear statements about the minimum wage.
Right. And I mean, one thing I've liked is now that data is much cheaper, and now that the tools of analyzing the data have become very cheap, because as a sidetrack, was it Fama? His Nobel Prize was doing a regression that any person with any knowledge of like whether it's Stata, R, or Python, whatever, they can do it, and even the like theory of it isn't super, like you don't need a Nobel Prize to like understand why this might work and to do it. So I'm very happy to see more economists or the reduction in costs in doing the specific analysis or doing a specific like econometric analysis or trying to build theory.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the move to data is undoubtedly a good thing. I mean, it doesn't come without costs, right? Obviously, sometimes I wonder if running a regression is too easy now, and you're like, there should be like some kind of waiting list or something. I don't know, like because you can just run so many different regressions that you haven't really thought about. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So for me, no, I like that regressions are cheap, but what I want to see is when regressions become cheap, the standards then get pushed higher. And so, now that, it's trivial to run a regression, you can make that super complicated structural model, you can spend a little bit more time on that. Or, instead of spending a little bit more time on that, you can spend more time on making your results more easily to be reproducible, because there's been some egg and face with a couple of economists.
Yeah.
And I really hope that the discipline starts, not making those types of mistakes.
Yeah, me too. So, William, where do you come on all this? You haven't said anything in a while. By the way, both of you, I know I'm kind of addressing you one at a time, but like, just feel free to jump in at any point.
Yeah, I mean, I have some experience in labor, but certainly that's not my like major background. And when things start really varying into macro, my education and background even then is not that much greater than you'd probably get from like an undergrad because I don't spend a lot of time
Mm.
in that space. But yeah, I just like to echo that. Yeah, it's good to see that. Um, I guess more and more people are getting access to the resources to ask, kinds of questions. In regards to it's funny, like there's two kinds of things that I think economists that do research really like to do. And of course, there's a big bias in academic publishing for finding results that are surprising,
Mm.
which really is a shame. Like when we think about how we learn about the world, it's as important to find uh, or maybe not as, but it is important to do replications and find no results, but it's very hard to get that published. Um, but anyway, the two things that you'll find that economists really like to do is they like to find surprising results that go against conventional wisdom,
Mm.
and they also like to apply really, really complicated tools to their problems because they're like, oh, this is a fun tool that I learned and now I have to use it. Which both come with their own um, kind of costs on the other side of it, right? So like more complicated models, of course, require more complicated assumptions, and if any one or a set of those assumptions are kind of violated, then you really have to call into question kind of the validity of whatever conclusions that they come up with. Um, and then, of course, if everybody spends time trying to find kind of the novel results that go against conventional wisdom, then there's a whole lot of space for um, you know, there's a certain bias to certain information that gets out there. That's for sure. So I think that there's actually a whole lot of, um, I guess, usefulness in maybe taking a step back and being like, hey, we're applying these really, really complicated econometric tools to these problems, and maybe it's because we've already used the simple tools for these kind of questions before.
Mm.
Um, and doing an identical study where we do the same thing again doesn't tell us a whole lot. So, maybe we can find something by using a more complicated tool. But there's, I think, a space to be said that maybe simpler is better with some of these kinds of questions. Especially when kind of the systems that you're working in um, are already very complicated. To like put a really complicated tool on top of that certainly creates like a whole lot of questions that you have to spend a whole lot of time justifying to maybe like a dozen people that can even understand what you're doing in the in the world,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
challenging.
So there's a whole host of issues with it, right? Like one is transparency, and that's something we were talking about at the beginning, right? Like communication. The more complicated it is, the less people understand it, and that might even include the person who's like actually come up with it. You can craft a model that's so complicated that you're actually having a hard time really fully understanding it, right?
Right. Yeah, and the funny thing is that like I think a lot of academics and economists really like kind of showing off their technical abilities. It's kind of funny, like if you, for instance, like I have my working papers like publicly available, and like if you went there, you'd see,
Hmm.
I sketch out a mathematical model for like behavior,
Hmm.
and it looks really complicated in part, and I certainly didn't come up with a lot of that on my own. It's borrowed from other sources. But then like the practical application of it when I actually do like the estimation is actually really simple. There's a
Yeah.
great image out there that exists about like how to make your research more impressive where they take like a really, really simple like 1 + 1 = 2 and they expand it out into this really complicated math formula to make it
Oh.
look very
Oh
impressive.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I've seen
And
that.
I think there's an incentive to kind of do that um, because it looks very cool on when you send it to an editor, and if you make it too complicated, um, people will kind of just glance at it and maybe glaze over a little bit and be like, okay, like obviously you know what you're doing when maybe you were just kind of being flashy for the sake of being flashy. So there's definitely kind of that space that I think could probably use some improvement and some simplification and a little bit more self-reflection.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of signaling, isn't there? Basically, I think it's like, I mean, I think Deirdre McCloskey once said the number one compliment that an economist can give to another economist is that you're smart, right? And it's like, it's all about sometimes it feels like, especially if you're applying for like a job and stuff,
yeah,
you're signaling that you're smart, and it might be that people are just interested in how complicated your paper is because of what it proves about your ability, and not as much necessarily for what it proves about the world.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
But I want to raise this thing because I know econ, gets a lot of flack, especially for that. But when I talk to my friends, whether they're in physics, like a similarly mathy or even more mathy field, or I talk to my friends in philosophy, like this seems like a very fundamental problem when doing academic research. And I'm not really sure, you know, what sort of changes in the incentive structure or changes in like the peer review process like would need to happen to reduce these sort of problems. I don't know if either of you two have thoughts on this.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I do tend to agree in many ways. I think one of the one of the few legitimate criticisms of postmodernism, or what they call postmodernism, but what is actually post-structuralism, that people like Jordan Peterson have is like you can get really lost in jargon, right? And that's maths is just, I mean, economics has jargon too, but maths is like the economics jargon. I think it's like the sort of way economists communicate to each other, which can maybe deter outsiders in the same way that post-structuralism can deter outsiders with its use of language. So I think it's not unique to economics at all. Yeah, I don't have any suggestions though. I don't have any constructive suggestions right now.
Right. Yeah, because I had I mean, one of the stories we tell ourselves is that the math it makes it a little bit more difficult to be political than if we were to just use language. And at some point, I think I bought that in more, but I think it changes who and what can be snuck in, with the math. And this is probably very much echoes like the whether rational expectations make sense or where an economist, seem to have I don't know if it's a liking or like a bias towards like status quo than perhaps they really ought to.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. Does it make it? Does it make it less easy? I mean, the minimum wage debate is obviously really, really political, and I guess I'm not sure that either side of that is like more or less political than the other. But it's yeah, I don't like the idea that there's like a kind of view from nowhere. I always think that if you take like a given economic model, it will tend to have like some biases. Like a really basic one, right, is that economists look a lot at markets and capitalism, right, and they tend not to look at like other forms of organization uh, other than markets. And then you could say that that kind of promotes a view of markets as a default or something like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Even even among the like the senior academics that I knew, that were, pretty progressive, um, are also hugely, pro market in their own way. So you won't. I think in most econ departments, you get people who are pretty um, sympathetic, but definitely uh, solidly liberal in their perspective about and I mean liberal in like the classical like not like liberal within the U.S. liberal
Right.
versus conservative, but like liberal in the free market ideals um, kind of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Oh boy, I don't know how much I want to push on a what is a free market.
Oh, I mean, yeah, that's like a whole open question, and I will fully admit I am not somebody prepared really to speak a whole lot on the philosophy of economics, which I think is a shame. With the amount of time that I spent in education for it as a subject, that it isn't covered a whole lot. It's kind of
Yeah.
funny as a grad student, you go through basically a year of really basic. That's some like, okay, here's a more advanced version of macro and micro that you learn in undergrad. Here's some really advanced mathematics, and then you spend about a year taking classes related to the kind of field that you're interested in, and then you spend 2 to 3 years doing research. And unless if you're really on top of managing your time and have a lot of initiative in doing so, there isn't as much of a space talking about the humanities side of a humanities subject and the philosophy of it, which is a pretty big missed opportunity. That should probably even be, it's kind of funny, like thinking about people who go into higher education. I get asked the question every once in a while because like I want to go to grad school for economics. Like, what should I study? And the standard answer is if you want to fit in with the curriculum, you should take something like like linear algebra in undergrad. But I do think that it would be definitely an improvement to see more of the abstract kind of philosophical elements of what motivates different economic theory be incorporated into the field, probably even at an undergrad level. And again, that's coming from somebody who any knowledge of that is on my own time, and it's not a whole lot because I didn't ever really have it in a classroom setting.
Yeah, you don't. You're not likely to have the type of chat that we're having now, unless, well, you can do it voluntarily, but you know, you can't. You won't write an essay on the philosophy of economics in like the vast majority of economics departments, right?
Yeah.
So this is where I'm probably going to be shilling my school a lot, but Chicago, at least in the undergrad, is one of the few schools that force. Oh God, what is it called? They basically force like everyone to take the same classes, and they're generally your Western canon, starting from your Greek philosophers. You get introduced to sort of the Enlightenment of like Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, and then you go into sort of more modern day like Foucault, Nietzsche, and Kant, and more on. And so they have like a very strong core curriculum. That's what it's called.
Yeah.
Where you sort of get exposed to that, and I think that allows the econ department to sort of double down on the okay, we're going to, if you want to do the honors track, which is what I did to like get ready to go to grad school, like day one you're going to learn about Lagrangians, you're going to learn about like basically all these mathematical tools to prepare the structure, or prepare to learn then the structures or the different types of models that will be used. And I actually really like that style of learning.
Oh yeah, so that's. I mean, is it really interesting that Chicago has that kind of setup, right? Because I guess crudely, some people might associate it with a more like kind of uncritical, straightforward, let's just learn the theory type perspective. But what one area of agreement I actually often find with like, I guess what you could call like free market types, I suppose, is like they do often agree about like the philosophy of economics being important. And I've just done it again. I've just literally rolled off the edge with being an important part of economics and understanding like the political and moral aspects to the discipline.
Right. The trope is all the politicians are going to talk about the wealth of nations, but all the true economists, the true free market economists, they'll point to the theory of moral sentiment.
Yeah, exactly. Have you read those? I'm not. I haven't read Adam Smith too much firsthand. Have you? Did you read them while you're at Chicago?
Yeah, I had to read. So for one of my social classes, I took this class called, what was it, Power, Identity, and something. I don't know. It's like their famous core curriculum class, and one of those quarters was we read The Wealth of Nations, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, First Capital of Das Kapital, and oh boy, I'm missing the name of the Durkheim book I had to read.
You did wait? Did you read? Sorry, did you just say that you read the first part of Das Kapital?
Yeah.
The only person in the world who ever has, actually.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there was more tryhards in my class who, really read it or really understood it as well.
Is that the bit where he does all the definitions? Isn't that just like the most confusing bit? Like people say, Capital Volume 3 is actually like much more easygoing. I mean, you're still talking about Marx, right? So it's not easygoing,
Right.
but it's a bit more applied and a little bit more easy to understand for somebody. Whereas because he rewrote the first bit of Capital, and he's got it's just a lot of definitions and really, really tough kind of hardcore Marxist stuff.
Right. So, I mean, there you learn about like the alienation of labor. You learn about like his labor or like his version of labor theory of labor. Yeah, it's pretty dense, and it's also been almost a decade since I've read it.
But you're not sort of going back to it.
I mean, I look on my shelf and every so often I'm like, it'd be nice to go back, but my most recent venture in a big book was Why Nation Fails. I finally decided to read it, and it wasn't too bad. I enjoyed it.
It wasn't too bad. That's such an enthusiastic review.
Well, because I'm really not trying to read a book this large. Like I don't like I understand why economists don't like writing books generally, because oh god, is it a lot of work, and I only have so many hours of the day to play Age of Empires, and I don't know if I'm willing to make that trade-off. But I enjoyed it.
I do actually respect to that. You need your Age of Empires time. By the way, you're like a really good Age of Empires 2 player.
I mean, so the answer to that is no, but yes, or maybe yes, but no. In that, like,
it's on your CV.
Yes, I did put it on my CV. I like putting other fun things on my CV. I mean, I was a mod for your Discord because it's a fun conversation starter. But in terms of how I play Age of Empires, I could probably beat any average player, but I've never actually been in a tournament setting.
Right. Okay. You could be. I mean, I honestly, I'm I feel like I'm just not very good at strategy games, I have to say.
One thing that's been tiring from strategy games is just a lot of it is the game has been optimized, or like the beginning of the game has been optimized to such an extent where like you're forced to basically just repeat the same moves or the same set of moves for the first, whether it's 5, 10, 20 minutes, depending on the game. And then the game actually starts. And I don't know how much I like that.
Yeah, with AoE 2, that's why I stopped playing it. Because it's like, and you've got to get the start like exactly right. Like you literally, if you get it out by a second, then it's like you've definitely lost. That's sort of what I found. Is that what you find as well?
I would say. So in comparison to other like real-time strategy games, like the most famous one is StarCraft. Age of Empires is less, what's the word? Less punishing. That's what it is. And so maybe not the 1 second, but if you don't know the general, like if you don't have like a plan basically from the beginning, you're generally gonna have a hard time because the better moves from the other person like start compounding relatively quickly, and it can be hard to catch up without some, I guess, important amount of randomness or important amount of like big plays.
Yeah, I mean, I play a lot of strategy games too, but the moment I have to start worrying about build orders and APM and stuff like that, my enjoyment of them goes down pretty significantly. And I've played a good amount of Age of Empires too, but I'm sure you could just mop the floor with me. It's been a bit since I've played it.
Sure. My only claim to fame in Age of Empires is I did have one game against a top player on multiplayer, Hera, and which he completely destroyed me playing like meme strategies. So that was a fun a fun time. But I guess not too many players played, so that I was matched with him.
Yeah, people are asking about Asimoglu and Robinson. So you sort of you said it was sort of okay, or something along those lines,
Sure.
right? But I don't know. Like, what did you actually think of their extractive versus inclusive institutions argument?
So I think it's a very reasonable argument. The I mean, perhaps it's just like a, duh sort of thing. And
Right.
I like the work that they do to show it. I guess I would like to see more examples of like extractive institutions, really being good. Like, I mean, this is the classic, like, Marxist or leftist argument that like, the imperial Western world can only sustain itself, through extractive development or whatever. And I mean, so I haven't studied this enough, but it just really seems like the case for that view of the world. It's not really founded on much, or at least it's hard to say empirically with the tools that they use to see that.
So for me, I feel like the claim that the West kind of exploits the global South in some respect gets confused with the claim that the West must do that.
Sure.
If you see what I mean, right? So, if you look at like...
I would agree there.
Yeah. So I don't think... It's a bit of a weird argument because I do find it like almost kind of conservative in some respects because it's sort of like... It reminds me a bit of like, A Few Good Men, the film.
I don't think I've watched.
Yeah, the one with Jack Nicholson and
It's where he's like, you can't handle the truth in the courtroom, or he's like, and it's
I've seen the memes.
we stand upon a wall and we guard you and
exactly. So it's sort of like we have to do these terrible things to keep your lifestyle as you want it to be, right? And it's like it's kind of like it seems like for me as a progressive. While I might agree that like some aspects of consumption might want to be tamed, some of the more wasteful parts of it, I don't think that it's impossible to have a world where, for instance, everybody has like public services that are similar to the ones that the Nordic countries have, right? For instance, and that seems like a weird argument to make that you're like, well, they can only exist because of some kind of vague, often unspecified imperialism, right? It's like Finnish. Why is Finnish education so great? Well, it's because of imperialism somehow. And I think you're right. Like there's definitely a lot of nuance to this discussion, and there are bad things that the Western countries do and have done certainly. But like I don't quite buy the sort of we can't have nice things argument. I don't know if I'm being very coherent in what I'm saying.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I really don't like how much it's then used to like justify some sort of noble lie. And I mean, it might be just, I don't know. I really don't like noble lies. Whether it's in like an academic setting or whether it's like from a business setting, I don't think anyone likes noble lies in general. But I think a lot more work for me would need to be done to like justify these sort of noble lie types of, oh, we must be evil to make the world a good place, or whatever version of that.
So what exactly do you mean that when people say, oh, we must be evil to make the world a good place? Like, what exactly are they arguing for then?
Right. So one, it's like a very ambiguous phrase. And it's sort of, granted, I was earlier saying like, oh, these econ models are very complicated, but the difference between what I was doing is that I would like to think that if you have the transparency and if you do the work to allow more people into the conversation, then you can figure out whether or not these choices that we make are actually justifiable. Because it seems to me that noble lies are used a lot in a like in a captured way, in the like, I'm going to get my way out and I'm going to justify it through some sort of greater good, than necessarily this is actually the best option for it at the time. But I don't know. I mean, there's another Chicago guy who's also been making the rounds, Mearsheimer, when he was talking about Ukraine and Russia, who has a book called, Why Leaders Lie. And, he goes on his whole thing of basically why the noble lie is a good thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he seems to have some not great takes on a lot of stuff recently. The more that things kind of get out more and more about him. So
Oh, man. Yeah, I don't know enough about IR. I know that at least my IR friends who, whether they went through Chicago or not, they also don't like him. I haven't met anyone who really likes him, but probably don't have enough, of the conservative friends or, that sort of type.
Even after being at Chicago.
No, I mean, like, yes, there are conservatives at Chicago, like, but most people in college our age are liberal, progressive. You have your fair share of Marxists.
Yeah, no, I was being a bit
It's-
facetious, by the way. I don't.
Oh, sure.
I know Chicago's definitely it's different from what it used to be, and I think yeah, like it's almost eternal that students are fairly on the left side of things, right?
Sure.
What? So
Hey,
somebody
but
asked in
sorry.
chat. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, so I was gonna say, I mean, you still have some pretty famous left-leaning figures, whether it's Bernie or whether it's what was it, the bullshit guy, bullshit jobs guy,
David
David.
Graeber.
Yeah, I mean, but I believe both of them studied, I think, at Chicago. So like, it has like Chicago's just known as a very political place.
Yeah, I actually didn't. I knew Bernie did. I mean, there was that. Okay, so here's an example of how I think not to use economics. Right, you remember that exam question after it was after
So Sanderson's class.
Sanderson's class after it was one of Bernie's economic advisors. I forget her name. It's Isabella something.
Oh, I don't
She
know. Yeah,
I can't remember, but she basically wrote a Guardian article calling for rent control or something, and then in the exam it was like how would a real economist respond to this, like as if it's kind of obviously wrong and stuff. And I think that's just like, I mean, that's so doctrinaire, right?
yeah. You have a couple people like that in Chicago, and Sanderson is a bit of a I don't know. So so I don't know how much of the stream you want to dedicate to
Yeah.
him.
No,
I
no,
know
no,
for
but
me, so for me, like he is one of the people who you have to take like the Econ 101 class. Luckily, if you take Econ in high school or if you just wait 1 year, you never have to take his class. And so that's what I did for his macro class because, oh boy, did I not enjoy his teaching style or his machismo or the old school sort of ways. It's just not my vibe.
oh wow, okay. So is he a bit of a relic?
I think
Which
so, and there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of rumors or there's a lot of, I just don't understand why he's still around and what he still do, and
yeah.
I just don't understand.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'll probably get
There's
to
a
that.
whole load of stuff. There's stuff about there's intellectual stuff, and then there's like the about him. That some of the issues like with that exam question, right? And then there's the more kind of the even more worrying stuff about harassment and all that type of stuff, right? That circulates.
Right,
Um,
right.
but
And
yeah.
I think there are ways to be snarky on exam questions.
Okay, of course,
I don't.
of course.
I think he just thinks he's funnier than what he actually is.
that's that's funny.
That's my most
Yeah.
charitable take.
Yeah. Somebody asked in chat, and you kind of, well, you sort of came close to answering this, but like, does Chicago have any left-leaning economists?
So I can't say about currently because my most left-leaning economist who I took class with is named Glenn Weil, and he's a bit of a wild one in terms of like he was playing the International during class a couple times.
Oh wow,
ooh.
okay.
He gave me the nickname as Lula. I don't remember why, but he liked giving nicknames to students.
Okay.
Um, yeah, he's an interesting type because he's very interested in political economy. Uh, he has like a wunderkid sort of aurora around him or like
Right.
reputation because he like did his PhD in like 1 year at Princeton.
I mean, that is, I have to admit, like, I don't like Wonder Kid auras around everybody. I have to admit that's quite impressive.
Yes.
I mean, I was impressed
Um,
that Asimoglu did his in 3 years. So
right.
to do one in 1 year, less than 3 years or whatever it is, that is
Yeah, yeah.
pretty astonishing. The first year, you don't even
Yeah,
know what's going on.
I mean,
yeah.
basically what he did is he did it all in undergrad.
Right, okay.
Like if you come in with a strong toolkit, to be able to do that work such that you're like, okay, well, college, I kind of already know this. Let me do a PhD. Then, that seems a little bit more reasonable if you really want to do a fast track. And I only say this because,
Yeah.
there were some students at U Chicago where you're like, these kids have had a schooling that I had a good schooling, but theirs is another level.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's like just if their parents are academics and stuff. I mean, this is a problem, isn't it? Like second generation academics, it's
Yeah, I saw that a
you're
lot
more
in
likely.
computer
Yeah.
science.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because in computer science, like the literacy that the average person, or even the average like college educated person in terms of computer science is just, I mean, it's as if you had to learn about like algebra, like in college or in grad school. There's like a huge deficit between what people can learn if they're just exposed to it versus like
Yeah.
what is at that level right now.
Yeah, I mean, you could if you start learning coding when you're really young, right? You can like
Yeah,
you
pretty
can
much.
just you can sort of it's like learning I mean it is learning a language, right? Literally.
Right.
So if you start doing it really early on, then you just got the most obscene advantages over other people.
Yeah, and I mean those advantages, luckily, there's not too many people like that, and you can overcome them, but they're very important advantages.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, so I just wanted to circle back, and I guess this is for you, William, because we were talking about economic theory and maybe dissing it a little bit, not too much. I was just wondering, like, because you look at like voting mechanisms and like how to choose leaders and stuff, right? So you're squarely in like the micro, experimental, and what's sometimes called political economy camp.
Yeah.
So do you like find aside from statistics? I think we all agree that statistics are useful, and the statistical part of economics is probably some of the best stuff and the most useful stuff. But do you find like economic theories of like social decision making? Do you find them helpful in what you do?
Yeah. In like what I do now, it's like the broader framework of thinking about how people make decisions is useful. The level of applicability to like estimating specific types of models of decision making probably I don't do as that much that anymore other than the general kind of tools of it. I mean there's just speaking more broadly, there's a lot of people who have criticisms and well-founded criticisms of kind of standard kind of decision theory kind of stuff in economics and how the framework of people behave in kind of microsystems. And that's fair. I think especially there's a lot of econ taught at the undergrad levels, especially is like this is the way that we teach it, and there's no other ways that you should consider it. But I would like to at least put out a defense of, even if you want to wholesale kind of reject the notion of some of the certainly more complicated or even like standard kind of micro assumptions, I think an education and a background in just thinking about how people respond to incentives and being exposed to that kind of way of thinking about problems in the world is abstractly just really good. And we can argue, the philosophy or the academic definitions about how we think people make those decisions. But
Yeah.
certainly coming from it from a perspective of like people respond to their environment or different incentives they have in the world and thinking about how do I make those decisions If I set up these kinds of systems, how do other people respond to them? Is an extremely useful, at least one framework to look at how kind of the world works and how we can, develop policy or uh, think
Yeah,
about our own lives within the context of those kinds of things, I'd say.
yeah, certainly like, you know, naive kind of policy analysis, naive analysis that doesn't really take into account how people are going to react and, be strategic in what they do, is much less useful, right? I mean, it's funny because it's easy to forget that a lot of people don't do that. They'll sort of be like, oh, well, we should. I don't know how many like conversations you have about like policies and economic policies with people who, quote unquote ordinary people, but they'll often just want to sort of ban stuff.
Yeah.
I find it's a really common opinion, right? They're not, take drugs as a simple example, right? They just want to ban drugs, maybe because drugs are bad or certain drugs, right? And then it's like, well, they're not really thinking. They're just assuming that if it's banned, that it's not going to exist anymore. And it's like, well, that's not the case. And I think economists are fairly good at like understanding that a black market's going to emerge and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And this actually kind of relates to, some of the research I've done, right? And like making decisions in the faces of different complexity. And it's kind of funny to watch like or maybe not funny isn't the right word, but like it's interesting to watch people be like presented with a really, really hard problem and then they just kind of like break down um and make a decision that they think is the best based on some sort of rule of thumb that they have in their own head. Certainly like there's all kinds of good jokes about like people calculating the maths to make the best decision possible, but like you don't have to present somebody with too complex of a problem before they kind of just rely on kind of gut intuition of how they make these sorts of decisions, which is interesting on its own.
So are you saying that it's like so this is like utility maximization, right? Like,
Yeah.
even if you don't interpret it literally, which I guess you probably shouldn't, right? It definitely helps you to think through exactly what we were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Like uh, it's funny on one hand to be like there's all this behavioral research about how people are horrible at conducting like their own kind of calculations of like risk and probabilities and expectations.
Yeah, people,
Um,
even doctors. I
and
think it's like if you give them, so it was really relevant for COVID, right? If you give them like rates of vaccination and vaccination success, it's like so and so amount of people have the vaccine. If they test positive for the disease, there's a so and so chance that they've had the vaccine or something. Can you, and then do some predictions. Doctors are bad at it. Doctors get it wrong, right? With
right.
those types of probability questions. Is that the type of thing you're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And um economics just tries to do a sneaky thing every once in a while where they're like, "Oh, if people aren't reacting to how we would expect them to, there must be some sort of hidden parameter in their
Uh,
utility function." And then
yeah,
we go back and fit it. It's a lot like back when they had like a Ptolemaic view of the universe where
yeah,
the sun was in the middle of everything. It's like, okay, we'll add an extra layer on top of this to make sure
yeah.
that our existing worldview fits.
I mean, I'm a
Um,
behavioral economist, right? And
yeah,
I do believe in many of the ideas in behavioral economics, but it is very guilty of that. It's like, well, let's just make the utility function more complicated, and people have got a reference point, and they've got loss aversion, and they weight probabilities, and it's like, okay, you've now added so many free parameters to your model that maybe the behavioral interpretation of what you're doing is somewhat right. Maybe people do compare. In fact, people almost certainly do compare themselves to reference points, right? But like,
yeah.
you've added so many parameters to your model that from a pure, a pure data science perspective, you're going to get a better fit, right? That you're not really, it's kind of like you're not really explaining the world, you're adjusting your model after the fact.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I guess to finish kind of my a little bit of a thought earlier, it's like on one hand, we have a lot of good research that people are bad at these things, and then you get another subject um, that relies on the classical assumptions about people being able to calculate their own kind of risks and expectations, and it kind of forgets about the other side of like, well, okay, but like people don't really do that all that well, um, which it's just it becomes its own challenge, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Gerdger Gerenzer, actually. I don't know how familiar you are with his work, but he's all about like what he calls boosts, which are like contrasted to nudges where you're trying to change people's behavior by changing the decision environment that they face. But boosts are more like when you're trying to improve people's decisions. So one of his insights about probability is like people are really bad with like percentages and decimals and stuff. We just can't really comprehend them very well. But if you convert it into frequencies, so like 1 in 10 people instead of 10% of people get like a lot better at dealing with it, and that's got something to do with like how we actually encounter chance in our lives.
Oh yeah, and writing actually instructions where you have uh in like a lab experiment where you have kind of probabilistic things that can happen in decision making, a lot of the times there's a lot of emphasis put on like imagine you're drawing a ball from a bag and there's so many balls in the like we don't
Yeah.
use statements about probability kind of for that reason. Because the moment that people can kind of like visualize a real life kind of scenario where it's like, oh, okay, like I intuitively get that a little bit more. They're much better at like kind of understanding those kinds of ideas than, just throwing numbers about probabilities out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I did actually put it in the title of the stream, and we've kind of touched on it, but I guess you guys have spoken a little bit to me about like what's called what you called. I think it was one of your terms, maybe you, Daniel. I can't remember, but econ hate, right? So there's a lot of hate for the economics discipline out there, and the name of my channel is Unlearning Economics, which can be misinterpreted, but like certainly I'm skeptical of elements of the discipline like we've been discussing. But I was just wondering what you guys think of like the economics hate, why economics gets so much hate, like in what respects it's fair, in what respects it's unfair, and so on.
Sure. So I think my general opinion is that I think I'm mostly sad about it. And I'm sad about it because, and maybe and I've seen this sometimes in whether it's in the Unlearning Economics Discord or other places, is people come in and they'll say very ideologically driven things, but then they can't sort of reason through the implications of it. And so I feel like sometimes, especially on the internet, there's so much hatred of economics that they sort of get blinded to what the academics are talking about. Now, at the same time, that division between what the academics talk about in economics and what a political or a politician's version of economics and how that economics has been used to justify their policies, that is very much a real thing. And a lot of people would say you're unable to divorce those two facts. So I don't know what the answer is here, because while I do think some of the hate is very reasonable, I think it can blind people to study the subject and sort of discard it in a very like anti-intellectual sort of way, which I don't like. But I don't know. I mean, what have you seen? I know you had your blogging days before. I was unfamiliar with your blog.
Oh, were you? Yeah. I mean, I was a bit more radical back then, I think, in like a number of respects, both academically and politically. But like, yeah, I think it sort of it stemmed from a real dissatisfaction. So let me tell you about my econ hate, right? So
Sure.
It stemmed from like basically wanting to study economics because the financial crisis happened like just before I went to university. And I was like, shit, this economic stuff seems like it might be kind of important, right? And also simultaneously, like, shit, it seems like nobody really understands what's going on, not even the economists, because it wasn't very well foreseen, the crisis, by pretty much anyone. I mean, there are exceptions. There's like, is it Raghuram Rajan? I think he was one of the few people who warned of it. But like a lot of the time, in a lot of cases, it wasn't. So anyway, I just wanted to make sense of that, as well as other things, things you saw in the news: immigration, the Eurozone crisis, inequality, whatever. And then when I actually studied economics at university, it was just like you didn't even talk about this stuff like at all. It was really strange to me. Like you were just doing these like models and these quite like watered down basic models, right? And it was odd. It was very strange not to be studying the crisis that was still unfolding, outside our lecture halls. And that was kind of what turned me on to like, well, okay, maybe the economics discipline isn't in the right place. And then I read a whole bunch of books that there's a whole load of books about it, right? And that sort of got me more onto the heterodox side of things.
Yeah, so I can only say that all my education at Chicago and college and post was after 2012. So I didn't experience any of that, and I am curious how much things were tempered by that event in like literally just the classroom setting. But I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think it is like, if my education had been like somewhat better, and I think even if it had been entirely mainstream, but like better mainstream. So for example, there's like the core economics textbook now, right? I don't know if you guys have taken a look at that.
I've glanced at it.
Yeah. So it's a bit more historical context and like all the types of things that maybe econ critics have been asking for. And like if I'd had that, I doubt I kind of would have gone down the path of being like an econ critic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy that these sort of events happen, and then you have these institutions that some react in poor ways. Most of them don't really know how to react. I mean, I see this with now, or I'm curious on whether people have that intuition with like January 6th in the U.S. or I don't know how much Brexit is going to change the zeitgeist in the UK.
In terms of what? In terms of just like making people doubt existing systems and things like that.
So yes, that like very broadly, but and then for the specific question on like Brexit, on like whether it's like you have your free trade versus your protectionism, like whether people are actually now rethinking or like actually visiting these ideas as opposed to just like spitting out the status quo and sort of going on with it, just because you never had to sort of think about these problems. You just sort of reiterated the parables that are told and sort of went on with the flow.
Yeah, exactly. If you didn't, if we didn't have the financial crisis, then I just I wouldn't have there wouldn't have been any reason to doubt it. And I might have been, the dissatisfaction with how abstract like economics degrees are is not new, right? I might have been a bit dissatisfied with like, okay, we're doing a bit too much modeling and not enough data or real world stuff, but probably not enough to like start a blog about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even on that idea, and I'm sure you guys have it with like the behavioral stuff where you live in a data scarce environment, and so you have to sort of build these additional structures that you hopefully reason out with math and there's sound. But I don't really know what the alternative is. If you want to promote scholarly or whatever, like you were saying earlier with the utility functions and you make them more complicated because on one hand you don't have enough data to say what really is the underlying effect, so you like return to the framework, but in returning to the utility framework, like you make so many parameters, but then, what's the alternative? Like a completely, like, what's it called? The Kuhnian thing, the paradigm shift of like, throw everything away and figure out a new start, but then, make sure that the old stuff, we still get the knowledge from the old stuff. Like, I just don't know what the answer to those
Yeah.
things are.
Oh yeah, I mean, I imagine whoever can come up with an alternative way of doing it would become very very famous very quickly. It's hard, right? Because like, you know, people in academic economics especially are very driven about like, they're empiricists. They like to measure the world, um, and having an answer to a framework about how can I empirically measure people's decisions or the effect of A on B. Um, there just really isn't another framework, I guess, that I'm aware of. Certainly not another mainstream framework outside of that. And I get, I guess, speaking still on the subject of like econ hate, right? Like my personal pet peeve is like people who reject the like empirics completely and are just like, oh, we just need to return it to like philosophical discussion basically. And I guess I understand to some degree. They're like, oh well, the empirics doesn't work, it relies on too many on unfounded assumptions, so we need to take a step back and kind of not worry about that so much. And it's funny because like there's kind of two different sides of the political spectrum who have that kind of to say about um, economics in general. So that's kind of my, I guess, personal point of annoyance, that to a degree, I probably have my own biases against. But I do kind of understand at least the criticism behind it. And it's like one of those when you don't like, I guess, know what it's hard to visualize things outside of like the universe of possibilities that you're not aware of. And that's just a challenge in general. Um,
Yeah.
for a lot of things.
I mean, I have got a lot of views on this, but like one of my views is that basically, I think economics has quite a large role, certainly larger than any other subject, to be honest. Full stop. Certainly than any other social science in like advising policy, and I think like there are a lot of economists, they think that, for example, central banks should be independent, right? And that's like kind of in a way insulated. At least they're one step away from democratic accountability. And I guess that's part of the reason it seems to attract so much public criticism, because there's like this role as kind of expert advisors that aren't necessarily accountable to the public, and then you get like a lot of people who are just really unhappy with that situation, and so they come out all guns blazing and think of economists as kind of unaccountable technocrats and all the rest of it. I mean, I think I don't think if economics had that authority and policy, it would receive as much public, because I'm sure there are lots of problems with, I don't know, geology, right? Archaeology, I don't know, subjects like this, right? But they're not of public interest in the same way as economics.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I actually thought about this kind of earlier in the discussion here that like, there's actually, I think, a lot of really well-meaning people in research that they got into economics because they like that it studies people and they care about doing research on causes and public policy that they view as like beneficial to society. But like certainly economics has much more of a political impact on the world that we have than something like sociology does, which studies very similar subjects but doesn't get as much of attention. And there probably isn't as much careful, I guess, reflection about the amount of excess influence that somebody's work might have compared to other social sciences. Like it was actually kind of, I can see that it was brought up in your chat a little bit. Like there's a fear of like turning, like we're studying people, and the recommended kind of implications of people's research affect people, and there's a probably a concern about turning people into data points and forgetting that your policy implications affect millions of people sometimes. um and so choosing how you word things, and like your recommendations are ultimately really important. And this actually kind of ties back to my concern about like making economics more accessible, because it seems like a real, certainly, shame and missed opportunity to be like, oh yeah, our research affects society at large, but like academic papers are so inaccessible to like anybody who tries to read them that doesn't have at least some education and experience reading economics papers, that nobody will understand them. um, and that seems very unfair in a lot of ways.
I mean, I think one of the things that I think is like, what do you guys think of like the economics profession having some more kind of formal credentials and like codes of ethics, like doctors do, and things like that?
Well, I would actually push back on. So I agree with everything that was previously said in like the critiques of economics. But I don't know how much I buy into the idea that economists are at the helm and sort of they ought to carry the burden of all the faults. I haven't just seen many political people like who are making these decisions have an econ degree. Like the economist is generally the advisor. The people is sort of at the actual helm, to throw the blame somewhere else, have legal backgrounds, have political science backgrounds. A lot of them have sociology backgrounds, whether or not the academic work of the field gets connected to it. That's less clear. So I guess I'm curious on what you think like economics is, or like what is particular about economics that so they receive this hate. Do you think it's that the academic field is more engaged with the political conversation, or like what do you think it is?
Yeah, there's an element of that. So it's the case that a lot of sociologists, for instance, like they don't really recommend policies that much. Like if you compare them to economists, right? Say even academic papers in economics, right? They'll have like usually have a policy recommendation at the end, and it's a bit like, sometimes it's even a bit like it's almost like expected, and like I'm not saying the economists might not even really want to recommend a policy. It's something that might be expected, whereas sociologists I've found are kind of a bit more reluctant to. But I mean, I think on one hand I hear your point. Like economists have more influence than other disciplines. That doesn't mean that they have as much influence in an absolute sense that maybe a lot of people are ascribing to them. Right? So it's like a lot of decisions are made by other people, whether they're politicians or whether they're people from other backgrounds in the civil service or whatever. So yeah, I think like relatively economists have a lot more influence, but in an absolute sense, like there's lots more going on behind most policy decisions.
Right, because I do hear the term like, oh, just that's economics, that's the justification, and sort of leave it at that. And I mean, I heard it a couple times. Well, that's the law, but I just don't. I don't see the vitriol as much.
for lawyers, I'd say there's a fair amount of vitriol for lawyers. I think it's like, I was thinking about this the other day actually, because doctors don't get that much public criticism. I don't think people tend to quite like doctors. Right. Although I maybe with COVID it's changed a little bit, but like I think with lawyers there's not, with economics there's a lot of active criticism, and there's like books written about it and stuff, and it's kind of continuous. Whereas with lawyers there's just this generalized distrust that nobody really likes them, which has kind of fallen into the background, right? Like there's lots of lawyer jokes out there and stuff like that.
Right, right. And I think it was Zumi talking about like economists ruin my city. No physicist has done that.
Mm.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you look at some of the work that chemists have done, or that, or whether you want to talk about like specific things physics done, that's a tough one. Who's like fucked up more? I mean, who was it? Some YouTuber just released like a video about the Haber process and the whole scientist. Just for anyone who knows, or who doesn't know about it, he invented a process of what was it? Extracting ammonia, or creating like ammonia for fertilizers. But that's also used for explosives, and so that was all used during World War One, and he was very much engaged in World War One. And then it turns really dark because the company that he developed also, being a German, being a chemist in post World War One, entering World War Two.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I think certainly part of the public perception of economics is that you have a lot of like economics in the broader political discussion has a lot of like public faces attached to it. Like you get economists that are acting as pundits often within news cycles and stuff like that, and you probably don't get that as much as like. I mean, I'm sure that every once in a while you get like a physicist or certainly like with all the COVID stuff, you've had doctors come on and be experts in their field as well. Yeah, climate scientists. Yeah, but at least like when climate scientists come on TV, they make generally like recommendations that are pretty good at like trying to save the planet. Whereas like sometimes you get some economics talking heads that like say stuff that is very unsympathetic to kind of the subject of their topic.
I mean, this is what. So you've got So take for example Art Laffer, right? I think he's a bit. If you talk about people who like critique economics and hate economics, they might mention like critical. Sorry, I just completely lost my way there. They might criticize the Laffer curve, right? They might not mention Art Laffer by name, but they'll know the Laffer curve, and they'll know like ideas like trickle down economics. And I think if sometimes for some people that's what they think of when they think of an economist, like that type of person on the media. Now it doesn't matter that he's not particularly respected in academia. It's not an especially trickle down economics isn't something that you learn. You might learn that reducing taxes across the board is good, I think, because taxes generally carry a deadweight loss in economics, right? So economists are it's fair to say they're not massive fans of tax as a rule, but that includes everyone's taxes, not just the rich's taxes. So that it's not an accurate depiction of economics, and yet he's someone who's maybe been really prominent in policy and on the media, at least in the past.
Right.
Yeah, it's totally.
And then a fun one is that I think actually it was Harold Uhlig has a more complex model. Harold Uhlig was another U Chicago professor. Another was in one of your other videos, but he also wrote about the Laffer curve, and he's saying, oh, actually, we're on the left side of the Laffer curve. We should we should be taxing more.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same with Piketty and Zuckman, right? And their analysis, it's sort of there's a lot of quite very, very econ theory heavy, very sophisticated economic analysis out there, which is pointing towards higher taxes, right? On the rich especially, which is interesting. Are you guys there?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just thinking about what you did. So it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly well-founded criticisms of the field and kind of disentangling like why people, and it's even like the hate that economics gets, I think to an extent is a little bit individual on people's gripes with it. it certainly is a field that probably acts like it's less political than it is. It has people with big egos that get on TV and defend sometimes bad policy. And in a lot of ways, I mean, if you go far left enough, economists are kind of viewed as these people who are guardians of a system that left-leaning or leftists want to do away with. So there's that whole kind of segment of criticism. So I guess it depends. To a degree, the question of like why does economics hate is also like why does it get hate from these different groups? Because I think there's a lot of different reasons that a lot of different camps get frustrated or outright have disdain for economics or
I mean,
economists.
there's a lot of kind of Austrian libertarian hate for it as well, right? Like,
Right,
if you
yeah.
look at, you mentioned some of the criticisms of empiricism, right? I mean, I see more of those coming from the Austrian people than from the than from the lefty people, because actually, I mean, it's funny. A lot of the data, I think, we were talking about the minimum wage, has tended to boost some lefty views a bit more, and then a lot of the Austrian libertarians are quite like anti-empiricist altogether, and they've kind of rejected it. So in that, I mean, for them, economics is actually more of a guardian of like Keynesian ideas, right?
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
God.
and
Wait,
there's
how
there's
many
a
Austrians do you actually know about? Because they're a weird bunch.
I know enough, enough to for anyone. I think I know like who are ones who are alive. There's Stephen Davies of the IEA, who's an Austrian of sorts. He's actually quite a reasonable guy. I quite like him. There's there's that dude. He's called like Per Byland or something. He's quite active on Twitter and he likes posts on Mises.org. There's Bob Murphy. He also posts on Mises.org. You know, he's like, have you heard of him?
I've heard of some of these people.
Yeah,
My short version is all the reasonable Austrians aren't Austrians. They're Chicago boys.
right.
Because if you're going to be conservative, at least the line is drawn at Chicago. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a line.
You may be right on that one. I mean, I don't. Yeah, Austrian economics doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Like, it's too dogmatic, and not just in terms of its political conclusions, which are obviously extremely free market, but like in terms of its anti-empiricism. Like, a lot of Austrians are completely anti-maths,
yeah.
like completely anti-maths.
Yeah,
And
because
then I'm just like, yeah, I don't know what you guys want other than just basically to be completely ideological and reinforce like what you already believe politically.
because like their idea is right that they form their set of beliefs from quote unquote like a set of logical conclusions where one is built on the other, and then if all of your logical foundations are sound, then the following what like by like an inductive reasoning sense, like the other things have to be true,
Hmm.
which certainly certainly is a way that you can view the world, I suppose. But it's hard for me to be like, okay, well, how do you at all kind of guide or make recommendations about how the world can work in a measurable way that isn't just like, oh, we think that this is the way it is because of our initial kind of assumptions, and then it is like tautologically true based on how
Yeah.
we've constructed the logic, which is just having like my exposure to like listening to people talk about that is insanely frustrating because it's like there's no room to kind of discuss it. It's almost a little bit circular in its own way.
It just seems to be like I really it's quite difficult to argue against because it is basically pretty quasi-religious, is right. It's just like what we deduce is true, and you can't test it against the real world at all in any way.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
So like, what do you? I mean, what do you? What do you want me to say to that? Like, I don't
Yeah.
really. I mean, and so the praxeological axiom, the fundamental one that Mises came up with, right? It's like all human action has an end, has a purpose, which is, I guess, true, but compatible with pretty much any political statement or economic statement I can imagine. Like, human action has a purpose. Okay, well, you can say that and then be a Marxist, right? In my opinion.
Right, and yeah, the idea is that human action has a purpose because the action exists, so therefore, like, it's like, yeah,
You get into some very weird
yeah.
territory there, like, and then there was like, I remember somebody was like, oh, if you doubt the human action, if you're trying to disprove the human action axiom, then you've just proved it because you're acting purposefully yourself. And it's just like what are you talking about? Like, just absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. So I mean,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, because I'm quite pluralist. So this is, I mean, to bring the conversation back round, right? This is where my econ hate has settled, in the sense that I'm like, okay, all I want is for there to be room for other perspectives. Like I mentioned Georg Gigerenzer within the realm of behavioral economics. I think he does some really interesting stuff. He has like alternative kind of non-utility based models that seem to do a pretty good job at predicting behavior in some experiments at least. So I'm a pluralist, but there are things to like, I think, maybe in some areas of Austrian economics, and I certainly like Hayek's essay on the use of knowledge in society and how markets work. I think is quite a compelling vision.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I in undergrad did like a study about like betting markets, and of course, like all of that stuff about, you know, kind of theories about how markets take up all public information because there's like a financial incentive to do so, is of course like deeply influenced by Hayek. So there's certainly parts of different areas to take from, even if you don't necessarily agree with like the field as a whole, I suppose.
You know, you mentioned Austrians that I know. So there's George Selgin, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, and Larry White, and they've written some interesting stuff about like free banking and banking systems before central banking, which I think, I mean, I don't know that I'm a free banker after reading it, but I certainly think it's interesting to note that central banks have, you know, not been around forever, and you can have other financial systems without them. Like, there's some very interesting historical evidence on that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm less familiar with banking stuff.
Yeah. I'm not expecting you to give your verdict on free banking as such. I was just saying that there's some good stuff out there, but you have to get past the wall of nonsense that we were just talking about, and like praxeology and all that, because none of that free banking stuff, it's just historical, right? It's like, here's some stuff that happened in history and it's interesting, nothing to do with human action having a purpose. Just stupid. Seems stupid to me that they base their whole thing on that.
Yeah, on that. So I've yet to like speak to like an Austrian academic, you know, because there's not too many of them. Even at George Mason, which is like they're like the pinnacle school in the U.S. for that. It's like moving away from Austrians. But like the thing that confuses me is that no other discipline does this like purely, or we're going to reason from a priori statements to then, and then because of that reasoning, necessarily that's the case that the real world is like that. I mean, in mathematics or any other sort of or philosophy, any other discipline that uses statements like this, like you can construct completely coherent, complete, reasonable worlds, even if you're assuming your logic is perfect. These multiple worlds exist, and choosing between them seems like a very nice thing for empiricism to come in. But I mean, we don't have an Austrian here to defend their position.
No, we don't.
I don't know how.
Maybe one day I will try and get one too. But yeah, it's like there are so many logically true statements that you can make about the world. You know, gravity could, objects could be naturally repelled from each other. Like that could be the law of gravity, right? You know, like there's nothing logically wrong with that. It's just doesn't happen to be anything like the world we live in.
Right, and in that example that you showed up, it might be the case that the world, or like the universe or the reality can exist, or a version of reality can exist with that phenomenon.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's not clear how to square that circle. So I don't understand Austrians.
No, me neither. I think it's clear that none of us do. So I don't know if I have any Austrian fans, I'm sorry for not giving you a chance to defend yourselves. I'm just sort of ranting about Austrian economics.
Somebody made the comment, or this is completely unrelated. Somebody made the comment earlier, how'd this guy on this horse get all the way up in the tree? And it's
Yeah. Sorry,
I haven't played. I haven't.
Have
played
I
much
just
of
done
the
that first
Microsoft
time, by the
version.
way? Can everybody appreciate that I just did Loretta first time?
Yeah, I played a
Not talking
little bit of
about
the
economics.
original,
Yeah.
a
Sorry,
little
carry
bit
on.
of the. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was saying to you, Carrie, you played a little bit of the
Oh
original.
yeah. Oh yeah, I played the original Dark Souls a little bit, but I don't have a whole lot of experience with much of the FromSoft games.
Yeah, they are just amazing. I think they're the best thing that's happened to gaming. Like, I honestly wasn't really gaming that much. I think I used to game when I was younger, and I came back for Breath of the Wild when that came out, and I got a Switch. And then I got Dark Souls remastered on the Switch. Yeah, I was just like, Jesus Christ, I don't think I can play any other RPG type game now, because the combat's just like so interesting on this. Like, it's just so much better than anything else. And like, I can play like, strategy games. Like, I've been playing AoE4 and like League of Legends and stuff. But like, when you play, like, I don't know, The Witcher. Did you guys ever play The Witcher?
No, that's another one that I somehow missed out on.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, it's a great story, amazing adventure, great visually, but the combat now, like, if you compare it to something like Dark Souls, it's just bad. Like, it's no good. And it's like, I do think that From Software kind of changed games, and yeah, I mean, Elden Ring is definitely a masterpiece. I do still think Dark Souls 1 is better. Maybe just because it's the original, maybe it's because it's the first one I played, but it's like, it's a super, it's so well balanced, whereas Elden Ring is massive. Dark Souls is just like, it kind of takes you through a fairly linear path, but it's just really well constructed. I mean, how far did you get with it before you sort of rage quit?
Well, I didn't really rage quit. I was actually like doing it in the most, I guess, casual way possible. Where like many people would probably criticize how I play those games, where I was actually kind of going through it kind of cooperatively with a friend of mine who really liked it, and I think we made it through Anne Orlando.
Oh,
And then I
right. Well,
fell off
but that's like the hump, though. Once you've beaten Ornstein and Smaug, then you're like, yeah, you're playing. Well, you're not playing sailing because it's Dark Souls, but you know what I mean. Like, that's kind of the bit where you're like, you've got no more parts where you're just thinking, oh my god, I can't play this game. I've got to give up on it. I found
right.
anyway.
Yeah, I know I made it essentially past the most bullshit fight.
Yeah.
And then kind of I don't know, there were I think the friend I was playing with, we kind of just got busy and didn't come back to it.
It's difficult when you're playing it together as well.
So one of these days when I'm not going through with stupid builds and playing kind of for memes with a friend of mine, I'll go back to it and actually kind of have the experience rather than have somebody handhold it through it, and because I know that the growth and overcoming the challenges are kind of the thing that people get out of these things, and having somebody just kind of guide me through it is not quite the same experience that most people are in that for.
Yeah. The sense of accomplishment when you beat a boss, I think, is not something you get in many other video games. I'd say it's just. Is very good, and it's less. I think one of the criticisms I'd have of Elden Ring is because there are so many bosses, and you encounter them sometimes when you're like a bit OP, and they're actually not very hard. You aren't as excited when you beat a boss as you are in Dark Souls 1. You're excited after every single boss, but yeah. So guys, like I think, yeah, I don't know. We've been going for like 2 hours now, and I've probably got to cook myself dinner, and I've beaten a boss. So I don't know. Is there anything that like we didn't cover that you guys wanted to chat about with economics?
I think that's good on my end. I'm slowly gaining my uh, Econ Discord Infinity Gauntlet with Econoboy and Academic Econ. Should probably reach out to like a more explicitly post Keynesian or a
Well, Cartesian
Austrian.
Otter had one, didn't he? But I don't. I think it got banned for some. I don't. Discord can be weird when it just like shuts down servers seemingly semi randomly. Like I find that. But he had the post Keynesian Economist server. I mean,
Right.
I left every server except my own and Econoboys, not because I'm narcissistic, but because I'm just not very good at Discord, and I found like it stressed me out feeling like I had that many Discords that I had to catch up on. If you get
Oh
me.
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Like 95% of the discords I am are just completely muted because it drives me nuts to log on and see all the sidebar lit up with all the
I
notifications and
think
stuff like
so.
that.
Yeah. You've got to disable at everyone, like mute at everyone at channel, and then if somebody's mentioned you, obviously it's polite to respond to it. But somebody did say, I think in my server, the first rule of Discord is that you don't you don't read the chat above you. You literally just start where you've logged on, and that like
Yeah.
it just makes it much easier to engage with.
But yeah, I don't really have anything more to touch on. Like you, I'm gonna go make lunch after this instead of dinner.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, well, no. So thanks so much for coming on, guys, and sure we'll probably chat again one day on here, and I'll obviously continue to chat to you two guys on Discord.
Yeah, for sure. And if there's like ever a specific topic, I know we kind of came in with this, the discussing the econ hate, but if there's ever kind of a development within the econ space that you ever wanted to chat about, I'd be more than happy to
Yeah,
hop on
yeah,
for a
some
little bit.
econ
Yeah.
news. There's plenty of drama out there for us to talk about, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always kind of funny. Well, funny again in an interesting way because it often affects really real people very negatively. See how things develop in the academic space between big names and junior researchers, for instance.
Yeah, there's
But
definitely a
yeah,
divide between, I think, junior researchers and like the old guard. I mean, you were talking about Sanderson, probably the most extreme example of that, and then you've got like a lot of young economists. I describe them as like pretty progressive, to be honest, in terms of their policies. They just, even if they're kind of out and out mainstream in terms of the economics they do, they'll probably be fairly progressive, like liberal in the American sense of the word. And I feel like, and they're definitely more woke, I think, like in terms of like diversity within the discipline. So there does seem to
yeah,
be a bit of a divide. So I don't know. Yeah, maybe that'll flare up one day and we can discuss it.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, like I'm having a hard time seeing like even the like previously like there was like some alliance between like the market liberals and like the conservative party, but with Trump and just the populism that has now engulfed that political party, I don't know which economists are like willing to basically hold their nose and go on with that. So, but we'll see.
No, yeah, exactly. It really it shook things up in a number of ways, didn't it, Trump? Because he's so anti-free trade as well.
Right.
That which is something that economists really don't agree with, even if they're conservative in some other respects.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I guess we will stop there. But yeah, thanks again for coming on stream, and I'll see you guys later. Have a good day.
Have a
Absolutely,
good
yeah.
one.
You have a good one.
See you. Okay, everyone. Whoa. Right, I'm gonna stop. There's another boss here. He just looks like one of those putrid tree avatars who are, well, on a bridge it might be slightly more difficult, but they're not that exciting. But yeah, I'm gonna stop in a second. Just a few more enemies. Okay, no, no, let's stop here. There's a stone sword key bit. We'll stop here. But thanks so much for coming, and thanks for persisting with me, even though it wasn't working at first. But yeah, see you guys on Tuesday. We're going to talk about climate change. It will be a more serious stream. See ya.